The text on my phone blurred as tears threatened to spill down my cheeks. I blinked them away, refusing to give in to emotion when I needed clarity most. The message from our Chicago restaurant's financial controller had arrived at 3 in the morning. Significant discrepancies found in quarterly projections. Someone altered numbers after your approval. Need to discuss ASAP. After everything I'd survived, the devastating phone call ending my marriage, the betrayal, the hard-won divorce settlement that made me an equal partner in the business, I now faced a new threat. Someone was sabotaging the empire I'd helped build. I placed my phone on the marble countertop of my brownstone kitchen and poured a cup of strong black coffee. The early morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating the space I'd created for myself in the 2 years since my divorce from Richard Montgomery, my ex-husband, who once thought he could dismiss 13 years of marriage with 8 cold words over the phone, had learned the hard way that I was not a woman to be underestimated. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon, with its hefty infidelity clause, had become his undoing when his affair with 22-year-old Brittany came to light. Now, we existed in an uneasy professional partnership, 50-50 owners of the Montgomery Restaurant Group, a collection of high-end establishments that had only grown more successful since I'd taken an active role in management. But this message suggested someone wanted to change that balance of power. I had my suspicions. My phone rang, displaying James Harrington's name. The sight of it brought a small smile to my face. In the 18 months since we'd begun dating, James had become a steady presence in my life. Thoughtful, brilliant, and most importantly, a man who saw me as an equal rather than an accessory. "You're up early," he said when I answered, his voice warm even through the phone. "Trouble at the Chicago location," I replied, quickly explaining the controller's message. James, an antitrust attorney who understood the complexities of corporate maneuvering, was quiet for a moment. "This doesn't sound like a simple accounting error. The timing is suspicious, especially with the board meeting next week." My thoughts exactly. I took a sip of coffee, mind racing through possibilities. "I need to fly to Chicago today. Cancel dinner with the Robertsons?" "Already done. I'm coming with you." I started to protest, but he continued, "Not as your protector, Alexandra. As your partner. 2 legal minds are better than 1, especially when someone might be trying to undermine you." That was the difference between Richard and James. One had always needed to be the center of attention, while the other understood true partnership. 3 hours later, we were boarding a flight to Chicago. I'd already spoken with Sarah, my loyal assistant of 8 years now, who was pulling all the financial reports from the past 6 months for comparison. Thomas Jenkins, my law firm partner and longtime mentor, was covering my cases for the next few days. As we settled into our first-class seats, I couldn't help comparing this journey to the last time I'd flown to Chicago with Richard, when we'd gone to convince Chef Marcus to stay, rather than accept a competitor's offer. "Penny for your thoughts?" James asked, studying my face with those perceptive gray eyes. "Just thinking about patterns," I replied. "Last year, we nearly lost Marcus to Ellington Group because someone leaked our expansion plans. Now we have mysterious alterations to our financial projections right before a critical board meeting. These aren't coincidences. You think Richard is behind it?" I gazed out the window as the plane began to taxi. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but yes, he's never really accepted our equal partnership. In his mind, I'm still that 20-year-old receptionist who should be grateful for his mentorship, not an equal business partner with her own vision. "Then we need concrete evidence," James said practically. "Speculation won't get us anywhere with the board." The flight gave me time to review the documents Sarah had sent. The discrepancies were subtle but significant. Projected revenues for our newer locations had been reduced by 12%, and expenses inflated by similar margins. Small enough to attribute to conservative forecasting, large enough to suggest the company was underperforming since I'd taken a more active role. It would undermine my credibility at the board meeting where I planned to propose our expansion into sustainable farm-to-table concepts, an initiative Richard had resisted. When we landed in Chicago, a text from Sarah was waiting. Found something. Call ASAP. I stepped away from the gate while James collected our luggage and called her immediately. Alexandra, she said, her voice urgent. I checked the metadata on those altered files. They were modified using Richard's executive login credentials 3 days ago, but that's not all. I found emails between Richard and Harold Ellington dating back 6 months. My stomach dropped. Harold Ellington, owner of our biggest competitor, had been trying to acquire our restaurant group for years. What kind of emails? Discussions about a potential merger that would effectively dilute your ownership shares. There are mentions of solving the partner problem. I think he means you, Alex. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. After everything, Richard was still plotting to push me out, not just from his life, but from the business I'd helped build. Forward everything to my secure email. And Sarah? Not a word to anyone else. At the hotel, James and I spread the documents across the desk in my suite, creating a timeline of Richard's apparent duplicity. The emails revealed a carefully orchestrated plan. Richard had been secretly meeting with Ellington for months, discussing terms that would see him maintain operational control, while I would be relegated to a silent minority shareholder. This explains the Marcus situation last year, I said, the pieces falling into place. Richard wasn't trying to keep Marcus. He was helping orchestrate his departure to weaken our Chicago location before the merger. James examined an email chain with a sharp eye. They needed board approval for any merger. That's why they're manipulating the financials, to make the case that the company is struggling under joint leadership. My phone rang. Richard. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but strategy demanded I maintain normalcy. Alexandra, he greeted me, his voice carrying that carefully cultivated charm that had once made my heart race. I just heard you flew to Chicago. Is there a problem with the numbers I should know about? The casual mention of the numbers confirmed my suspicions. He knew exactly what I'd found. Just doing due diligence before the board meeting, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. The controller flagged some discrepancies I wanted to check personally. You always were thorough, he said, a note of condescension barely disguised as compliment. I'm flying in tomorrow morning. Perhaps we could have dinner, discuss strategy for the board. I have some ideas I think could benefit us both. I caught James's eye across the room. He nodded slightly, understanding passing between us without words. Dinner sounds good, I agreed. La Maison at 8? After hanging up, I turned to James. He's going to try to sell me on the merger, make it sound like it's in my best interest. While hiding that he's been sabotaging the business to force your hand, James added. Classic corporate strong-arming. I walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline as twilight fell. You know what's ironic? When we were married, Richard always said I'd be a force to be reckoned with someday. He just never imagined that force would be directed against him. That evening, we met with the financial controller in person. Martin Chen had worked for the restaurant group for 15 years and had always been loyal to the business itself, not to either owner specifically. I noticed the alterations during my quarterly review, he explained, pointing to specific line items. The changes were subtle, but consistent, always making your initiatives appear less profitable than they actually are. Did you confront Richard? I asked. Martin shook his head. I came directly to you. After what happened with Chef Marcus last year, he hesitated. There have been rumors about a potential sale to Ellington. I was concerned. You did the right thing, I assured him. Can you restore the original projections before the board meeting? Already done, but... Martin looked uncomfortable. Mr. Montgomery has called an emergency executive committee meeting tomorrow afternoon, before your dinner. The official reason is to discuss strategic opportunities. But I wasn't invited. James and I exchanged glances. Richard was moving faster than anticipated. We need to get ahead of this, James said after Martin left. If Richard presents the merger to the executive committee tomorrow. I was already reaching for my phone. I'm calling Thomas. We need to review my shareholder agreement options. 2 hours and multiple legal consultations later, I had my strategy. The shareholder agreement Richard and I had signed after the divorce contained a clause preventing either of us from selling shares to competitors without the other's approval, a provision I had insisted on to protect both our interests. If I could prove Richard was negotiating with Ellington against the company's best interests, I could potentially force him to sell his shares to me instead. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed irrefutable evidence of his betrayal, evidence that even Richard's most loyal board allies couldn't ignore. Tomorrow, at the executive committee meeting, I told James as we finalized our plan, Richard will expect me to be blindsided, reactive, emotional, the same way he expected me to fall apart when he asked for a divorce over the phone. He's always underestimated me, and it's always been his downfall. James smiled, that quiet expression of confidence that had become so dear to me. What are you going to do? I'm going to let him think he's winning, I replied, a calm certainty settling over me. And then, I'm going to take back everything he's trying to steal. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an unexpected message from an unknown number. You should know what your ex-husband is planning. Meet me at Lakefront Coffee, 7 a.m. tomorrow. I showed James the message, suspicion evident on both our faces. It could be a trap, he warned. Or it could be someone who knows more than we do, I countered. Either way, I need to go. We'll go, James corrected. Together. As I lay awake that night, I thought about how far I had come from that devastating phone call in my corner office 2 years ago. The woman who had stood frozen in shock, hearing her husband end their marriage without so much as a hello, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and far more dangerous when crossed. Richard had taught me many things during our 13 years together, but the most valuable lesson came from our divorce. I was capable of far more than either of us had ever imagined. Tomorrow, he would learn that lesson again, this time permanently. Lakefront Coffee was a small establishment tucked away from the main tourist areas, the kind of place known only to locals. James and I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the emergency exit. The nerves in my stomach weren't fear, but anticipation. Another piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. What if no one shows? James asked quietly, his hand resting reassuringly on mine. Then we proceed with what we already know, I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. But someone will show. Richard's schemes always leave collateral damage. At precisely 7 o'clock, a familiar figure walked through the door, and my breath caught in my throat. Brittany, Richard's former mistress, the young woman whose existence had revealed the truth of my marriage. She looked different now, more polished, more confident, her blonde hair cut into a stylish bob, her clothing professional rather than the trendy outfits she'd worn when I first met her. Her eyes found mine immediately, recognition and determination in her gaze. As she approached our table, I felt James tense slightly beside me. Alexandra, she greeted me, then nodded to James. Thank you for coming. Brittany, I acknowledged, gesturing to the empty chair. This is unexpected. She sat down, placing her designer handbag, one I recognized from the same collection Richard had once bought me, on the table between us. I'm sure it is. I'm in town for a fashion exhibition. I graduated design school last year, just opened my own boutique in Boston. I nodded, recalling the email she'd sent me after moving back to Boston. Congratulations, but I doubt you asked to meet about your career. Brittany's professional composure slipped slightly, revealing the younger, more vulnerable woman beneath. No. I'm here because Richard contacted me 3 weeks ago. He wanted me to help him with something unethical. When I refused, he threatened me. Threatened you how? James asked, his attorney's instincts engaged. He invested in my boutique last year, she admitted, looking embarrassed. I didn't connect it to him at first. It came through a venture capital firm. But he let me know he could pull the funding and bankrupt me if I didn't cooperate. What did he want you to do? I asked, though I was beginning to see the outline of Richard's plan. Brittany reached into her bag, and removed a flash drive. He wanted me to testify at your board meeting that you knew about our affair before the divorce, but turned a blind eye for business reasons, that you essentially committed fraud during the divorce proceedings by pretending to be blindsided. The coldness of the scheme shocked even me. Richard wasn't just trying to push me out of the business. He was attempting to retroactively justify his betrayal by making me complicit in it. And this is? James nodded toward the flash drive. Recorded conversations, emails, his entire plan to merge with Ellington and force you out. Brittany pushed it across the table toward me. He didn't just contact me. He's been gathering dirt on board members too. Leverage to ensure they vote his way. I picked up the flash drive, this small piece of plastic that potentially held the key to Richard's undoing. Why are you helping me? The last time we met, you were just starting over. Brittany's expression hardened. Because I rebuilt my life on my own terms, just like you did. I won't let him take that away. And I won't help him do it to you either. Men like Richard, they think they can just use people and discard them when convenient. As she spoke, I studied her, seeing not the young mistress who had unwittingly participated in destroying my marriage, but a woman who had grown from that experience, just as I had. Thank you, I said simply. This could make a significant difference. After Brittany left, James and I returned to the hotel to examine the contents of the flash drive. What we found exceeded my expectations. Richard had documented everything. His meetings with Ellington, his strategy to manipulate the financials, even his plan to use Brittany against me. Most damning was an email to Ellington confirming that he had been the one who leaked information about Chef Marcus last year, deliberately attempting to weaken our Chicago operation to drive down the company's value before the proposed merger. This is more than corporate maneuvering, James said, his expression grim as we reviewed the evidence. This is fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, corporate sabotage. He could face criminal charges. I leaned back in my chair, processing the scope of Richard's betrayal. He was so convinced of his own superiority that he created a paper trail. Classic Richard, always believing he's the smartest person in the room. What's your next move? James asked. I checked my watch. 10 o'clock. The emergency executive committee meeting was scheduled for 2 that afternoon. First, I need to speak with Marcus. If Richard tried to poach him for Ellington once, he might try again. Then I need to call Thomas and update our legal strategy. Chef Marcus met us at the closed restaurant an hour later. As I suspected, Richard had approached him again recently, this time suggesting that the chef training program bearing his name, the initiative that had convinced him to stay with us originally, might be discontinued under new management. He implied you were planning to leave the company, Marcus explained, his expression troubled. Said I should consider my options before the board meeting next week. And did you believe him? I asked. Marcus shook his head. Not entirely. That's why I wanted to talk to you directly. The training program has been too successful to abandon. We've got waiting lists 3 years long. I showed him the evidence of Richard's planned merger with Ellington. Under their management, the program would almost certainly be cut. Ellington's business model is built on standardization across locations, not chef-driven creativity. By the time Marcus left, we had not only secured his continued loyalty, but gained another ally for the coming confrontation. The chef had agreed to attend the executive committee meeting to present the latest program results, numbers that directly contradicted Richard's manipulated financials. Thomas called as we were preparing our strategy for the committee meeting. Alexandra, I've reviewed everything you sent, my mentor and law partner said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of New York's most respected attorneys. You have grounds not just to block the merger, but to force Richard to sell his shares under the corporate malfeasance clause of your shareholder agreement. Can we make it happen today? I asked. Not without a full board vote, Thomas replied. But you can present the evidence at the executive committee and request an emergency board meeting. Given the nature of the allegations, they'll have to comply. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for battle. James would not attend the executive committee meeting. His presence would alert Richard that something was amiss. Instead, he would be working behind the scenes, contacting key board members with whom he had relationships. As I dressed for the meeting in a tailored emerald suit that matched my eyes, the same color I'd worn the day I confronted Richard's attorney during our divorce, I felt a strange calm descend. 2 years ago, I had been devastated by betrayal. Today, I was prepared for it. The executive committee met in a private dining room at our flagship Chicago restaurant. I arrived 15 minutes early to find Richard already there, deep in conversation with Harold Ellington himself, a surprise addition I hadn't anticipated. The other committee members, our CFO, Michael Brennan, our operations director, Patricia Lowry, and board representative, David Whitaker, looked uncomfortable with Ellington's presence. Richard looked up as I entered, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Alexandra, you know Harold, of course." "D, by reputation," I replied coolly, shaking the competitor's hand. Ellington was in his 60s, with the polished appearance of old money and the sharp eyes of someone who had built his fortune by identifying weaknesses in others. I wasn't aware external parties had been invited to our internal committee meeting. "Harold is here at my invitation," Richard said smoothly. "He has a proposal I think we should all hear." Patricia Lowry, who had always been supportive of my initiatives, frowned. The agenda didn't mention any proposals from competitors. "Which is why I called this emergency meeting," Richard countered. "Sometimes opportunities arise that can't wait for formal procedures." I took my seat at the table, placing my portfolio and tablet before me with deliberate calm. "Well then, let's hear what's so urgent it required circumventing proper channels." As Richard launched into his presentation about the strategic benefits of merging with Ellington Group, I watched the reactions around the table. Michael seemed intrigued by the financial projections, the same manipulated numbers I had discovered. Patricia looked skeptical, while David maintained a careful poker face. "The market is becoming more competitive," Richard concluded. "This merger would strengthen our position while allowing us to maintain our brand identity under the Ellington umbrella." Harold Ellington nodded in agreement. "We've admired what you've built and want to preserve it, just with the added security of our resources." "And what happens to current leadership in this arrangement?" I asked, looking directly at Richard. "That's the beauty of this structure," Richard replied smoothly. "I would continue as operational lead for the Montgomery division, while you would be free to pursue your other interests." His tone suggested he was doing me a favor. The financial compensation would be substantial, of course. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, allowing everyone to absorb what he was really proposing. My systematic removal from the company I had helped build. "Before we continue," I said calmly, "I'd like to address some discrepancies in the financial projections you've presented." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Discrepancies?" I opened my tablet and sent files to the display screen on the wall. "These are the actual performance metrics for the past 2 quarters, certified by our controller this morning. They show our profitability is significantly higher than the numbers in your proposal, particularly for the initiatives I've been leading." The room grew tense as the committee members studied the conflicting reports. Richard's expression darkened. "There seems to be some confusion in accounting," he said dismissively. "We can sort that out later." "There's no confusion," I replied, my voice steady. "Just deliberate manipulation. The same kind that occurred last year when someone leaked our Chicago expansion plans to Ellington, nearly resulting in the loss of Chef Marcus." Harold Ellington shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not having expected this turn in the conversation. "That's a serious accusation," David Whitaker noted, his attention now fully engaged. "Yes, it is," I agreed, "which is why I've prepared a complete report." I pressed another button on my tablet, and new documents appeared on the screen. Emails between Richard and Ellington, the manipulated financial reports with metadata showing Richard's login credentials, and finally, the documented evidence of Richard's attempt to sabotage our Chicago operation by facilitating Chef Marcus's potential departure. The room fell completely silent. Richard's face had gone pale, while Ellington was already reaching for his briefcase, distancing himself from the unfolding disaster. Given these findings, I continued into the silence, I'm formally requesting an emergency board meeting to address Richard Montgomery's breach of fiduciary duty and to invoke the corporate malfeasance clause of our shareholder agreement. Richard stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're manipulating the situation to push me out. No, Richard, I said, rising to meet his gaze. I'm simply holding you accountable for your actions, something you never expected from the young receptionist you married 13 years ago. The difference is, I have evidence to support my claims. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with Ellington making a hasty exit and the committee members calling for immediate verification of the documents, I maintained my composure. Richard's carefully constructed scheme was collapsing around him, just as he had once collapsed my carefully constructed life with a single phone call. The battle was far from over. Richard would not surrender his position without a fight, but the first decisive blow had been struck. As I gathered my materials, preparing to leave the stunned committee members to process what they had learned, Richard stepped into my path. "This isn't finished, Alexandra," he said quietly, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. I met his gaze steadily. "You're right, Richard. It's just beginning." The next 24 hours unfolded with the intensity of a courtroom drama. After the explosive executive committee meeting, the board chair called an emergency session for the following morning. I spent the evening working with Thomas, who had flown in from New York, and James, preparing our case against Richard. We gathered in my hotel suite, documents spread across every surface, building an ironclad presentation of Richard's betrayal. "We need to anticipate his defense," Thomas warned, his decades of legal experience evident in his cautious approach. "Richard won't go down without a fight, and he still has allies on the board. He'll claim this was all standard business exploration," James added, "that he was just investigating options without any intention to move forward without board approval." I nodded, studying the email chain between Richard and Ellington that Brittany had provided. Except his own words contradict that, he specifically discusses ways to neutralize Alexandra's voting power and structure the deal to minimize her interference. That goes well beyond exploratory conversations. Sarah called with updates from New York. She had discovered additional evidence in Richard's corporate email, messages he thought had been deleted but remained on the server backup. These included conversations with 2 board members suggesting financial incentives for their support of the merger. "This is beyond corporate politics," Thomas said grimly, reviewing the new information. "This is entering criminal territory. Attempted bribery, corporate fraud." "I don't want him arrested," I said, surprising even myself with the realization. "That's not my goal." James looked up from his notes. "What is your goal, Alexandra?" I considered the question carefully. 2 years ago, when Richard had ended our marriage with that cold phone call, my initial reaction had been pain, followed by determination to get what I legally deserved. Now, facing his second betrayal, I found my motivation was different. "I want to protect what we built," I answered finally. "The restaurant group, the people who work there, the vision we created together before everything fell apart. And I want Richard to face consequences for his actions, not criminal charges, but the loss of what he valued most: control." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then our strategy is clear. We use the shareholder agreement to force him to sell his shares, but we offer an alternative to public exposure." The board meeting was scheduled for 9 the next morning. I hardly slept, my mind racing through scenarios, countering Richard's potential arguments, preparing for every possibility. When my alarm sounded at 5, I was already awake, standing at the window watching dawn break over Chicago. James found me there, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You're ready for this," he said quietly. I turned to face him, grateful for his steady presence. "Yes," I replied, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "I've been ready since the moment he underestimated me the first time." The boardroom was tense when we arrived. All 12 board members were present, unprecedented for an emergency meeting, along with key executives. Richard sat at one end of the long table, flanked by his attorney, Martin Goldstein, the same lawyer who had handled our divorce. I took my place at the opposite end with Thomas and James beside me, a symbolic battle line drawn between us. Board Chair Eleanor Reynolds, a formidable woman in her 60s who had helped build several successful companies, called the meeting to order with a grim expression. "We are here to address serious allegations of breach of fiduciary duty and corporate sabotage brought by Alexandra Montgomery against Richard Montgomery," she began. "Given the gravity of these claims and the evidence submitted to the executive committee yesterday, the board has agreed to hear both sides before taking any action." She nodded to me. "Ms. Montgomery, please present your case." I rose, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. 2 years ago, in Goldstein's office during our divorce negotiations, I had felt a similar scrutiny, but where that moment had been colored by shock and betrayal, today I stood with clarity and purpose. "Thank you, Madam Chair," I began, my voice steady. "What I'm about to present demonstrates a systematic attempt by Richard Montgomery to undermine this company's financial stability, sabotage successful initiatives, and secretly negotiate a merger that would effectively end the Montgomery Restaurant Group as we know it. Over the next 45 minutes, I methodically laid out the evidence, the manipulated financial reports, the leaked information about Chef Marcus, and our Chicago expansion, the secret negotiations with Ellington, and the attempts to secure board votes through improper means. I presented emails, metadata analysis, witness statements, and financial discrepancies that painted a damning picture of deliberate sabotage. "The motivation is clear," I concluded. "By making our company appear less successful under joint leadership, Richard hoped to convince this board that a merger with Ellington was the only viable path forward, a merger structured to maintain his position while eliminating mine." The room was silent when I finished. Several board members were visibly disturbed by the evidence, while others maintained careful neutrality. Richard's expression had darkened progressively throughout my presentation, his habitual charm replaced by barely contained anger. "Mr. Montgomery," Eleanor said, turning to Richard, "you have an opportunity to respond." Richard rose with the confident posture I knew so well. Shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the stance of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. But today, it seemed more performance than substance. "What we've just heard is a carefully constructed narrative designed to vilify standard business practices," he began, his voice carrying that familiar persuasive tone. "Yes, I explored options with Ellington Group. As any responsible business leader would do, I investigated potential strategic partnerships in a challenging market. At no point did I commit to any arrangement without board approval." He dismissed the manipulated financials as different projective models using conservative estimates, and claimed the communications with board members were simply relationship building, rather than attempts to secure votes. "As for Chef Marcus," Richard continued, "Alexandra conveniently omits that it was her inflexible approach to our Chicago expansion that created tension with our culinary team in the first place. My conversations with Marcus were about retention, not poaching." I remained expressionless, letting his distortions hang in the air. The board would see through them. The evidence was too compelling. When Richard finished, Eleanor opened the floor for questions. The interrogation was rigorous, with board members pressing both of us on specific points. Throughout, I maintained composure, answering precisely and honestly, while Richard's responses grew increasingly defensive. The turning point came when David Whitaker, who had been present at the executive committee meeting, addressed Richard directly. "Yesterday, you brought Harold Ellington to an internal committee meeting without prior notification, presenting merger terms that you claimed were preliminary, but appeared quite developed. If this was merely exploratory, why the secrecy and urgency?" Richard faltered momentarily, Market conditions demanded quick action. I was bringing an opportunity to the committee for consideration, not presenting a finalized deal. Yet the documents you presented included post-merger management structures that significantly altered Ms. Montgomery's position without her knowledge. David persisted. How is that consistent with your fiduciary duty to all shareholders? Before Richard could respond, Eleanor interrupted. I believe we have sufficient information to deliberate. I would ask both Mr. and Ms. Montgomery and their representatives to step outside while the board discusses this matter. In the anteroom outside the boardroom, Richard approached me for the first time since the executive committee meeting. This is unnecessary destruction, Alexandra, he said, his voice low. We built this company together. Why tear it apart out of spite? I met his gaze steadily. I'm not tearing it apart, Richard. I'm saving it from your ego. The same ego that made you think you could discard me from our marriage with a phone call, then discard me from our business with backroom deals. You've changed, he said, studying me as if seeing a stranger. No, I corrected him. I've become who I always was beneath the shadow of your expectations. The difference is now I know it too. Before he could respond, the boardroom door opened, and Eleanor's assistant asked us to return. The atmosphere had shifted. There was a resolute energy in the room that hadn't been present before. Eleanor addressed us both with formal gravity. The board has reached a decision based on the evidence presented and our fiduciary responsibility to the company and all shareholders. We find that Richard Montgomery has acted in violation of his duties as an officer and director of this corporation through unauthorized negotiations, misrepresentation of financial data, and actions detrimental to the company's interests. Richard stiffened beside me as she continued. Under the terms of the shareholder agreement, specifically the corporate malfeasance clause, the board has determined that Richard Montgomery must divest his ownership interest in the Montgomery Restaurant Group. A murmur ran through the room. Richard's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. I maintained my composure, though inside, a wave of vindication washed over me. However, Eleanor continued, in recognition of Mr. Montgomery's founding role and contributions to the company, the board proposes the following resolution. Rather than public proceedings that could damage the company's reputation and value, Mr. Montgomery will sell his shares at fair market value as determined by independent valuation. She turned to me. Ms. Montgomery, as equal partner with right of first refusal, you would have priority to purchase these shares should you choose to exercise that right. The proposal was more than I had hoped for. A clean separation that protected the business while giving me the opportunity to assume full control. It was justice without destruction, accountability without public humiliation. The board will recess for 1 hour to allow both parties to consider this resolution, Eleanor concluded. We strongly encourage acceptance rather than protracted legal proceedings that would harm all involved. As the room cleared, I remained seated, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. After 13 years of marriage and 2 years of uneasy partnership, the final tie between Richard and me was about to be severed. I felt neither triumph nor sadness, but a profound sense of rightness, as if the universe had finally balanced its accounts. Thomas broke my reverie. Alexandra, we need to discuss financing. Buying out Richard's 50% will require significant capital. I nodded, my mind already working through the logistics. I've been anticipating this possibility. I have investment partners prepared to back me if needed. James raised an eyebrow. You've been planning for this? Not specifically, I admitted, but I've learned to prepare for all possibilities where Richard is concerned. See, in truth, I had been quietly building relationships with ethical investors who shared my vision for the restaurant group's future, emphasizing sustainability, chef development, and community engagement, principles that Richard had always viewed as secondary to expansion and profit margins. When the board reconvened, Richard had composed himself, once again the smooth businessman I had known for so long. But beneath the polished exterior, I could see the calculation in his eyes as he agreed to the resolution with one condition. "I will accept the board's decision," he stated, "provided the valuation reflects the company's true worth, not the artificially depressed value created by recent misunderstandings." It was a reasonable request. Richard wanted fair compensation for his shares. I had no objection. This wasn't about financially destroying him. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. "I agree to those terms," I replied. Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Then we have a resolution. Independent valuators will be appointed immediately, with a target of completing the transfer within 60 days. As the meeting adjourned, board members and executives filtered out, many stopping to speak quietly with me or Richard. The dynamic had shifted palpably. Where once they had seen us as equal partners with Richard, perhaps holding the edge in experience, now they looked to me as the company's future. Richard approached as I gathered my documents. For a moment, he simply stood there, the man who had once been the center of my world, now a figure from a closing chapter of my life. "You won," he said finally. "I underestimated you. Again." "This isn't about winning, Richard," I replied. "It's about consequences. Something you've managed to avoid for most of your life." He smiled faintly, an echo of the charm that had once dazzled me. "What will you do with it? The company, I mean. I'll build it into something better than either of us imagined." My voice was firm, confident, something that honors the vision we once shared before your ego got in the way. Richard nodded slowly, accepting the truth of my words. "You know, when we met, when you were that young receptionist looking at me with those wide green eyes, I thought I was the one doing the teaching." "You were," I acknowledged. "Just not the lessons you intended." As he walked away, I felt the final weight of our shared past lifting. The divorce had freed me personally, but this moment, this was my professional emancipation. The company that bore our name would continue, but now shaped by my vision, alone. Thomas and James joined me as I prepared to leave. "Congratulations," Thomas said warmly, the pride of a mentor in his eyes. "You people get to witness justice unfold so perfectly in their lifetime." I smiled, thinking of the long journey from that devastating phone call to this moment of resolution. It's not quite finished yet. We still have the valuation, the financing, the transition. James took my hand, his touch grounding me in the present. Always the attorney, thinking 10 steps ahead. "But maybe, just for today, you can pause and acknowledge what you've accomplished." He was right. In the quiet of my heart, I allowed myself to feel the full significance of this victory, not over Richard specifically, but over the doubt, the pain, and the limitations others had tried to place on me. "Dinner?" I suggested. "I think we've earned a celebration." As we left the boardroom, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a wall of glass. A confident woman in an emerald suit, standing tall, eyes clear and focused on the future. Not Richard's wife, not Richard's business partner, but simply Alexandra Montgomery, finally and completely her own person. The next 60 days were a whirlwind of activity as I navigated the transition from equal partner to sole owner of the Montgomery Restaurant Group. The independent valuators worked methodically, examining every aspect of our operations to determine fair market value for Richard's 50% stake. Meanwhile, I assembled my investment team, secured financing, and began planning for the future, a future I would shape according to my vision. James remained by my side through it all, his legal expertise and unwavering support proving invaluable as we worked through the complex details of the buyout. Thomas provided guidance from New York, his decades of experience helping us anticipate and address potential complications before they arose. "The valuation report comes in tomorrow," I told James over dinner in my brownstone kitchen 3 weeks after the board meeting. "My financial team estimates Richard's shares will be valued between 45 and 50 million. James whistled softly. "That's a substantial check to write." Worth every penny, I replied, pouring us each a glass of wine. The restaurant group generated $18 million in profit last year alone. At that rate, the investment pays for itself in less than 3 years. We had settled into a comfortable routine since returning from Chicago, working long hours during the week, then spending weekends together at my brownstone or his apartment on the Upper West Side. It wasn't the whirlwind romance of my youth with Richard, but something steadier, more balanced, built on mutual respect and shared values. "Have you spoken to Richard since the board meeting?" James asked. I shook my head. "All communication has been through attorneys. I think it's better that way." In truth, I had seen Richard once, unexpectedly, at Chef Marcus's training program graduation ceremony. We had acknowledged each other with polite nods from across the room, but hadn't spoken. Something in his expression, a mixture of resignation and perhaps grudging respect, suggested he had finally accepted the new reality. The valuation report arrived the next morning, setting Richard's shares at $48 million, exactly within the range my advisors had predicted. With financing secured through a combination of private investors and my own resources, I signed the final paperwork exactly 57 days after the board meeting. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day Richard had called to end our marriage 2 years earlier, I sat in the conference room of our corporate headquarters, signing the documents that would make me the sole owner of the Montgomery Restaurant Group. Richard was present, looking impeccable as always in a tailored suit, his silver-streaked dark hair perfectly styled. We exchanged few words beyond the necessary pleasantries, both aware that this moment represented the final severance of our intertwined lives. As Richard signed the last document, transferring his shares to me in exchange for the bank draft laying on the table between us, he paused. "I always thought it would be my name alone above the door," he said quietly, almost to himself. Funny how things turn out. I studied him, this man who had once been the center of my universe, now a figure from my past. "The name stays," I replied. "Montgomery Restaurant Group has built a reputation for excellence. That doesn't change with ownership." He nodded, a flicker of something like gratitude crossing his features. "You'll do well with it. Better than I would have, probably." It was the closest thing to an apology I would likely ever receive from Richard. An acknowledgement that perhaps, in the end, I was the better steward for the business we had built together. After the papers were signed, and Richard had left with his attorneys, I remained in the conference room, allowing the magnitude of the moment to sink in. From 20-year-old receptionist to sole owner of a multi-million-dollar restaurant group, a journey I could never have imagined when I first looked up to see Richard standing at my desk, charming smile in place, asking if I could direct him to the creative team. My phone chimed with a message from James. "Congratulations, CEO Montgomery. Dinner tonight to celebrate?" I smiled, typing back my agreement. Unlike Richard, who had always needed to be the star around which others orbited, James took genuine pleasure in my success, his ego secure enough to celebrate my achievements without feeling diminished. That evening, as we toasted with champagne at the small bistro near my brownstone, James asked the question I had been considering myself. "Now that it's officially yours, what changes will you make first?" I took a sip of champagne, savoring both the moment and the possibilities before me. "First, I'm implementing the sustainability initiative Richard always resisted. Farm-to-table sourcing for all locations, renewable energy, zero-waste policies, then expanding Marcus's training program nationally, with scholarships for underprivileged culinary students. Social responsibility and culinary excellence," James noted. "Ambitious and profitable," I added. Contrary to Richard's beliefs, ethics and economics can align beautifully. Our customers increasingly want to know their dining choices reflect their values. The transition announcement went out the next morning, a carefully crafted press release that presented Richard's departure as a planned succession rather than the result of corporate malfeasance. It was a courtesy I chose to extend, Not for his benefit, but for the company's. Public scandal would only harm the business and the employees who depended on it. The industry response was immediate and largely positive. My reputation as the driving force behind our sustainability initiatives and chef development programs had grown over the past 2 years, making the transition seem natural to outside observers. Several influential industry publications requested interviews, eager to hear about my vision for the company's future. Within a week of taking full control, I called a company-wide leadership meeting, bringing in general managers and head chefs from all 8 locations for a 2-day strategic planning session. Many had worked with Richard for years and were understandably anxious about the change in leadership. "Let me be clear about one thing," I told them, standing before the assembled group in our corporate training center. "The Montgomery Restaurant Group has succeeded because of your talent, dedication, and creativity. That doesn't change. What will change is how we support you, invest in you, and grow together." Over those 2 days, I listened more than I spoke, taking note of their concerns, frustrations, and ideas, many of which had been dismissed under Richard's leadership. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical managers had begun to embrace the new direction. Chef Marcus approached me after the final meeting, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, when Richard first introduced you as his wife years ago, he used to say you were going to be a force to be reckoned with someday. I don't think he imagined this was what he meant." I laughed, remembering those words, how Richard had spoken them with pride back when my success reflected well on him, before it became something he resented. Life has a way of fulfilling prophecies in unexpected ways. 3 months into my sole leadership, the first quarterly results confirmed what I had always believed. Ethical business was good business. Our sustainability initiatives had garnered positive press, bringing in new customers curious about our farm-to-table commitment. The chef training program had attracted top culinary talent, elevating our food quality across all locations. Revenue was up 11% compared to the previous year. I was reviewing these results in my office when Sarah, still my loyal assistant, announced an unexpected visitor. "Brittany is here to see you," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. I hadn't spoken to Richard's former mistress since that morning in Chicago, when she had provided the evidence that ultimately led to his downfall. "Send her in," I replied, curious about what had brought her to New York. Brittany entered, looking every inch the successful designer in a stylish outfit of her own creation, confidence in her stride that hadn't been there when we first met. "Alexandra," she greeted me with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I assured her, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What brings you to New York?" "I'm opening a boutique in Soho next month," she explained. "My Boston location has been doing well enough to expand." "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "That's impressive progress in a short time." She nodded, a flicker of pride crossing her features. "I wanted to thank you in person. After Chicago, after you used that evidence against Richard, I expected him to follow through on his threat to pull his investment from my business." "Did he?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "No," she replied. "Instead, he sold his stake to me at a nominal price. Said he was exiting the fashion industry entirely." She smiled wryly. "I think losing to you changed something in him." The observation surprised me. I had been so focused on securing my own future that I hadn't considered how our final confrontation might have affected Richard. "Changed how?" Brittany shrugged slightly. "I can't say exactly. He seemed, I don't know, more reflective, less arrogant. When he transferred his investment to me, he actually wished me success without any of his usual condescension. The idea that Richard might have learned something from his downfall was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Perhaps losing everything he had tried so desperately to control had forced him to reconsider his approach to life. "I'm glad to hear it," I said honestly, "for both your sakes." After Brittany left, I found myself thinking about growth and change, how the devastating end of my marriage had ultimately led to this moment of professional fulfillment and personal peace. The young receptionist, who had once looked up to Richard with stars in her eyes, had become a business leader in her own right, not by emulating him, but by finding her own path. That evening, I invited Thomas and his wife Eleanor to join James and me for dinner at our flagship New York restaurant. As we celebrated the successful quarter and Brittany's surprising update, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To Alexandra Montgomery," he said warmly, "who reminded all of us that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fires." I thought about the journey, from that shattering phone call in my office to this moment of triumph, and realized that Thomas was right. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of something better, something truer to who I really was. Later that night, as James and I walked along the waterfront near my brownstone, he asked a question that caught me by surprise. "Have you thought about changing the company name, now that it's fully yours?" I considered the question, watching the moonlight play across the water. "No," I said finally. "Montgomery is my name too. I earned it, not through marriage, but through every decision that brought me here." James smiled, understanding in his eyes, "Including the decision to take back your power when Richard tried to dismiss you." "Especially that one," I agreed. "Besides, there's a certain poetic justice in keeping the name. Every time Richard sees a Montgomery restaurant, he'll remember that the empire he tried to take from me is now entirely mine." We continued our walk in comfortable silence, my mind drifting to the future stretching before me, a future I had shaped through resilience, intelligence, and the unwavering belief in my own worth that had emerged from the ashes of betrayal. The restaurant group was thriving under my leadership, expanding in directions Richard had never considered. James and I were building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than power imbalance. And somewhere in the city, perhaps Richard was reflecting on the lessons of his downfall, possibly becoming a better person for it. None of this would have happened if he hadn't made that cruel phone call 2 years ago, thinking he could dismiss me with a few cold words. Sometimes the end of one story is merely the beginning of a better one, a truth I had lived so completely that it had become the foundation of my new life. As we turned toward home, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for what I had lost, but for what I had found in myself after the losing. The woman who had once defined herself through her marriage had discovered that she was most fully herself when standing alone. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing my contemplative expression. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Just that some phone calls change everything, but not always in the ways we expect." 5 years passed, in what felt like both an instant and a lifetime. The Montgomery Restaurant Group had grown from 8 locations to 15 across the country, each one embodying the principles of sustainability, culinary excellence, and community engagement that had become my signature as CEO. The chef training program had expanded nationally, launching careers for hundreds of talented individuals who might otherwise never have had the opportunity to enter the high-end culinary world. Business publications that once described me as Richard Montgomery's wife now referred to him as Alexandra Montgomery's ex-husband, a subtle but profound shift in perception that never failed to bring a small smile to my face. On a warm spring morning, I stood at the podium in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, accepting the Restaurateur of the Year award from the National Culinary Association, the most prestigious recognition in our industry. The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard had been nominated for this same award 3 times during our marriage, but had never won. Now, 5 years after our final separation, I was the one holding the crystal trophy, addressing a room filled with the most influential figures in the restaurant world. "This award represents far more than individual achievement," I told the audience, my voice steady and clear. "It recognizes what's possible when we build businesses that honor the connections between food, people, and planet." When I became sole owner of the Montgomery Restaurant Group, Many industry insiders predicted failure. Too idealistic, they said. Not practical in this market. 5 consecutive years of double-digit growth have proven otherwise. As applause filled the room, I caught sight of James in the front row, pride evident in his expression. After 3 years of partnership, we had married in a small ceremony in my brownstone garden, surrounded by close friends and colleagues. Unlike my first marriage, which had been built on the unsteady foundation of admiration and power imbalance, this relationship stood on mutual respect and shared values. Success in this industry isn't just about profit margins and expansion, I continued. It's about creating spaces where people connect over exceptional food, prepared with integrity, by individuals who are valued for their creativity and hard work. It's about recognizing that how we source our ingredients impacts communities and ecosystems far beyond our dining rooms. After the ceremony, as James and I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, I spotted a familiar figure across the room. Richard stood near the bar, older now, the silver in his hair more pronounced. He was speaking with a group of investors, but his eyes met mine across the crowded space. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. I returned the nod, feeling neither animosity nor nostalgia, just a quiet recognition of our shared history and the divergent paths that had brought us to this moment. Later, as the event was winding down, Richard approached where James and I stood with Thomas and Eleanor Jenkins. "Congratulations, Alexandra," he said, his voice carrying the same confident tone I remembered, though tempered now with something that might have been humility. "The award is well-deserved. What you've done with the company is remarkable." "Thank you, Richard," I replied, genuinely appreciative of the acknowledgement. "I understand your new venture in California is doing well." After selling his shares to me, Richard had moved to Napa Valley, opening a small boutique hotel and restaurant that by all accounts embodied a more personal, less corporate approach than his previous enterprises. Industry gossip suggested he was happier there, more hands-on and less focused on aggressive expansion. "It's different," he admitted with a small smile. "Smaller, more personal. I'm actually in the kitchen sometimes, remembering why I fell in love with this business in the first place." There was an authenticity to his words that would have been unimaginable in the Richard Tharf I had married, a man who had been so focused on empire building that he had lost sight of the passion that started his journey. "I'm glad to hear it," I said sincerely. Richard hesitated, then added, "Your sustainability model, we've adopted elements of it at Montclair House. The local sourcing, the zero-waste practices. You were right about that vision. I should have listened years ago." The admission stunned me. Richard Montgomery, acknowledging he had been wrong and I had been right, was unprecedented. James squeezed my hand gently, recognizing the significance of the moment. "Better late than never," I replied, keeping my tone light. "The industry is moving that direction anyway. You're just ahead of the curve now." As Richard moved away to greet other attendees, Thomas chuckled softly. "Well, I never thought I'd see the day." Richard Montgomery admitting someone else had the better idea. "People can change," Eleanor observed. "Sometimes they need to lose everything to recognize what truly matters." Her words stayed with me as James and I returned to our hotel suite later that evening. Removing my earrings, the emerald ones I'd worn to confront Richard's lawyer during our divorce, now a talisman of sorts, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. "You're quiet," James noted, loosening his tie. "Thinking about Richard?" "Not exactly," I replied, sitting at the vanity. "More about how lives take unexpected turns. When Richard ended our marriage with that phone call, I thought it was the worst day of my life. Now, I recognize it was the beginning of becoming truly myself." James came to stand behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "You were always extraordinary, Alexandra. Richard just failed to appreciate it until it was too late." The next morning, I had a breakfast meeting with our newest board member, Charlotte Zhang. a brilliant sustainability expert whose insights were helping us take our environmental initiatives to the next level. As we discussed plans for implementing regenerative agriculture practices with our supplier network, my phone chimed with a message from an unexpected source. Brittany, saw the news about your award. Congratulations! Opening my third boutique next month in Chicago. None of it would have happened without you showing me what strength looks like. Thank you. I smiled, remembering the young woman who had unknowingly catalyzed the end of my marriage and ultimately helped facilitate my professional triumph. Like me, she had transformed betrayal into opportunity, building her own success story from the ashes of disappointment. My response was simple. We build our own legacies, one choice at a time. Congratulations on yours. That afternoon, I toured our newest New York location, a rooftop restaurant in Brooklyn with its own garden supplying fresh herbs and vegetables. The head chef, a recent graduate of Marcus's training program, proudly showed me around the space, explaining her vision for seasonal menus that showcased local producers. This is exactly what I hoped the Montgomery name would represent, I told her, genuine pride in my voice. Innovation, sustainability, opportunity, all while creating exceptional dining experiences. It's why I wanted to work for you specifically, she confided. Everyone in culinary school knows the Montgomery Group is where you go if you want to be part of the future of restaurants, not just repeating the past. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at our flagship Manhattan restaurant for the executive team, celebrating both the award and our fifth consecutive quarter exceeding growth projections. As conversations flowed around the table, Sarah, still my right hand after all these years, leaned closer to speak privately. I found something while organizing the archives for the company history project, she said, handing me a folded paper. I thought you might want to see it. I unfolded what appeared to be a performance review from my days as a law firm associate, written by Thomas shortly before my divorce. His assessment concluded, Alexandra possesses not only a brilliant legal mind, but a rare combination of empathy and strategic thinking. Given the right circumstances, she could become one of the most influential leaders in any industry she chooses. He saw it before I did, I murmured, touched by the evaluation from a time when I still defined myself primarily as Richard's wife. Many people saw it, Sarah replied with a smile. You just needed the freedom to see it yourself. Later that night, in the quiet of our apartment overlooking Central Park, a space we had chosen together, free from the memories of my life with Richard, James and I shared a nightcap on the terrace. The city lights sparkled below us, a carpet of stars above, and I felt a profound sense of contentment that had once seemed impossible. 7 years ago today, I said softly, Richard called me at the office and told me he wanted a divorce. 7 years and a lifetime ago. James studied me in the gentle light. Do you ever regret any of it? The marriage? The divorce? The battles? I considered the question carefully, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. No, I answered finally. Every step of that journey, even the painful ones, led me here. Without Richard's betrayal, I might never have discovered my own capacity for resilience. Without the divorce fight, I might never have claimed my place in the business. Without the second betrayal, I might never have taken full control and implemented the vision that made us an industry leader. I set my glass down, turning to face the man who had shown me what true partnership looked like. The difference between stumbling and succeeding isn't avoiding falls. It's what you build from where you land. To where you landed, James said, raising his glass in a toast, and to the extraordinary life you've built. The following week brought the announcement of our newest initiative, a foundation providing culinary scholarships to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Funded by 10% of our annual profits, the program would open doors that had historically been closed to those without privilege or connections. At the press conference, a young reporter asked a question that caught me off guard. Ms. Montgomery, do you think your ex-husband's betrayal was ultimately a blessing in disguise? The room grew quiet, other journalists clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the question. But after a moment's reflection, I decided to answer honestly. "I don't believe in disguising painful truths as blessings," I said carefully. "The end of my marriage was devastating. The betrayal was real, and the hurt was profound. What I do believe in is our capacity to transform pain into purpose, to use even our darkest moments as catalysts for growth." I paused, finding the words to articulate what I had come to understand through my journey. 7 years ago, I received a phone call that shattered the life I thought I would have. Standing here today, I can say with complete certainty that the life I built from those broken pieces is far stronger, more authentic, and more fulfilling than what was lost. Not because betrayal is a blessing, but because resilience is a choice we can make every single day. The room erupted in applause, not the polite acknowledgement of a well-delivered corporate message, but the genuine response to a truth that resonated beyond my personal story. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing plans for our next expansion, a culinary academy that would make world-class training accessible to students regardless of background or resources. On my desk sat 3 objects that represented my journey. The crystal paperweight Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary, now a reminder of a chapter closed. The award I had received the week before, symbol of my professional triumph, and a framed note from a graduate of Marcus's training program, thanking me for creating opportunities that had changed her life. Together, they told the story of Alexandra Montgomery, not as someone's wife or ex-wife, but as a woman who had transformed betrayal into triumph, pain into purpose, and limitations into possibilities. The empire I had helped build now truly reflected my values, my vision, and my unwavering belief that success meant nothing if not achieved with integrity. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus, calling from Chicago with news that our sustainability program had just won another national award. As I congratulated him, I couldn't help reflecting on how differently this phone call had ended compared to the one 7 years ago. That call had been an ending, delivered with cold finality by a man who thought he could dismiss me with a few cruel words. This call represented the continuing evolution of a legacy I had built on my own terms, a legacy of innovation, opportunity, and positive impact that would outlast any personal betrayal. After we hung up, I stood at my window, watching the lights of the city I called home, feeling a profound sense of peace. The young receptionist, who had once looked up to Richard with stars in her eyes, had become a leader others now looked to with admiration and respect. The woman who had once defined herself through her marriage now stood complete in her own right, her worth determined not by someone else's validation, but by the values she lived and the difference she made. The journey from that devastating phone call to this moment of fulfillment had not been easy, but it had been undeniably mine. Every step, every choice, every triumph hard-won and deeply meaningful. Richard's attempt to discard me had ultimately set me free to become the woman I was always meant to be, a justice more perfect than any legal settlement could provide. 7 years later, I finally understood the most important truth of all. Our greatest power lies not in avoiding betrayal or pain, but in what we choose to create from the experience. In that choice, made again and again in countless moments large and small, we find not just recovery, but transformation, not just survival, but triumph. And in the end, that is the most profound victory of all. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. What city are you watching from? And if your heart tells you to, feel free to leave me a tip on Buy Me a Coffee. Just check the first pinned comment. Thanks for keeping me company and for the coffee, and I'll see you in the next story.